Welcome to my channel, everyone. Sit back. Let the sound into their play. Chloe and the story, close your eyes and drift off to sleep in peace. First, please subscribe to my channel and let me know which country you're watching from.
Aşağı iniyoruz. İpi sıkı tutun.
The site. What the excavations revealed AOU ediate ROTULUPOTUULUD. There is a moment familiar to every archaeologist who's ever worked in Rome when spade strikes something that does not belong to the present century. It might be a fragment of colored mosaic still vivid, to 2000 years. It might be the curved top of a wall, its plaster surface bearing the ghost of a painted figure. It might be a coin, green with age, carrying the face of an emperor who died before the birth of Christianity. In that moment, the ground itself becomes a document, dense, layered, and almost impossibly rich. Rome is, in the most literal sense, a city built on top of itself, its living streets resting on the bones of everything that came before. The discovery of ancient Rome has never been a single event. It has been a continuous process spanning
Karanlık
centuries,
çöküyor. Bizi koru.
accelerating and slowing with the rhythms of scholarship and destruction and accident and war. Every generation has found new things, and in many cases, what they found has overturned or what the previous generation believed with complete confidence. This is one of the most striking features of Roman archaeology. It is a field in which the certainties of yesterday become the revision notes of today. The ground is still speaking. The story is not finished. What the excavations have revealed is simply beautiful. So beautiful that it stops the breath, even the most experienced scholar. Frescoes of Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash 79 CE, are probably the most famous example in the world. But Pompeii is far from alone. In Rome itself, underground chambers have been discovered with painted walls of extraordinary quality, vid guns, garden scenes, mythological figures, in motion, temporary architectural fantasies that create the illusion of spaces opening beyond the painted surface. The Domus Aurea, Nero's extravagant golden house, was built over and forgotten in an antiquity, its rooms sealed and buried. When Renaissance artists discovered underground chambers in the late 18th century and lowered themselves on ropes through holes in the ceiling to see the paintings by torchlight, witchlight. They were so astonished by they began copying the designs into their own work. The term grotesque, used today to describe a particular kind of ornamental style, derives directly from these underground rooms. The grottos where those decorators had created something that the world had not seen for 14 centuries. But it is not only beauty that the excavations reveal. Sometimes it is strangeness. It is evidence of practices and beliefs so different from modern assumptions. They force an assumption thinking of what we thought we knew about the Romans, who they were, how they lived, what they feared, and what they desired. The wildest discoveries of ancient Rome are myriad, demas. They are surprising, but because they are revelatory, they illuminate the gap between the Rome of popular imagination, the marble empire of Puev toga-clad senators and gladiatorial combat, and the actual lived reality of a civilization that was, in many ways, far stranger and more complex than the simplified version that's passed to cultural memory. Consider, for instance, the Roman relationship with the underground world itself. The Romans were obsessed with what lay beneath the surface of the earth in a way that went far beyond the practical concerns of mining or drainage. The earth had gods. The underworld had geography. The dead were present, in some sense, in the ground where they were buried. And the boundary between the living city and the realm of the dead was a matter of intense ritual concern. The pomerium, the sacred boundary of the city of Rome, was at the boundary between the world of the living and the world of the dead. Bodies were not permitted within it. The catacombs, cut in these soft volcanic rock beneath the Roman suburbs, were not merely practical solutions to the problem of burial. They were a spiritual landscape, a three-dimensional map of the afterlife, navigated by the faithful and the grieving, as much care as map of the living city above. The discovery of what actually lies beneath the streets of modern Rome has been ongoing since the Renaissance and continues today. Every time a new building is constructed or a new metro line is extended. In 2016, construction work for the extension of Rome's Metro C line, a project that has been underway for decades, stalled repeatedly by archaeological discoveries beneath the drill heads, revealed a set of rooms decorated with extraordinary frescoes dating to the late Republican period, approximately the 1st century BCE. The paintings showed garden scenes of remarkable naturalism. Perched in fruit trees, water flowing through channels, stone. The velvet of the Roman afternoon filtered through painted leaves. These rooms had been sealed for more than 2,000 years. The colors, when the workers broke through, were as fresh as the day they were applied. This is particular drama of Roman archaeology. The city gives up its secrets not on a schedule, not in response to careful planning, randomly, urgently, in the middle of the contemporary city's own urgent needs. A man digging a foundation for a new apartment block strikes a pop of a Republican-era wall. A woman playing roses in her garden in the suburbs finds a bronze statuette of a goddess, a child playing near the banks of the Tiber after a flood picks up a terracotta oil lamp, still stained with the residue of the oil that burned in it on some evening 2 millennia ago. Rome is not a site. Chapter. The body in the ground human remains. And they tell us of all the discoveries that Roman archaeology has produced. None speak more directly to the human reality of the ancient world than the physical remains of the Romans. Themselves. Bones are documents. They record diet, disease, occupation, injury, age, and with vision with a precision that no written source can match. And the bones of the Romans, recovered from cemeteries, from mass graves, from the sealed deposits beneath collapsed buildings, from the volcanic death-cast chambers of Pompeii and Herculaneum, have been telling their stories with increasing eloquence as the techniques of biological archaeology and ancient DNA analysis have advanced. What the bones reveal is sometimes confirmation of what written sources is already told us. Roman soldiers were, on average, well-nourished, and physically large compared to the populations they conquered in northern Europe. The dietary evidence from skeletal analysis, isotopic signatures that reveal a person ate over the course of their life, confirms the literary accounts of the Roman military diet: grain, legumes, olive oil, wine, and occasional meat, a diet that was calorically sufficient and nutritionally better balanced than many modern people assume. But the bones also contradict assumptions. Analysis of populations in Roman Britain has revealed that the empire's northwestern frontier was home to people of extraordinary ethnic, geographic diversity, individuals of North African, Middle Eastern, eastern end of Therania Gera, the Ura. In the archaeological record of Roman London, Roman York, and the forts along Hadrian's wall, the Roman Empire was, in the most literal biological sense, a world of movement, of people carried by military service, trade and slavery and simple ambition, to places their ancestors had never imagined. At Herculaneum, the city destroyed alongside Pompeii by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, it in some ways is better preserved. The discovery of approximately 300 skeletal remains in the boathouses along the ancient shoreline. One of the haunting fawning finds in the history of Roman archae. These were people who had fled to the beach when the eruption began, seeking escape by sea. They died there, killed by the superheated pyroclastic surge that swept down the volcano's slopes in the early hours of the disaster. Their bodies arranged in the postures of their final moments. Analysis of these remains has revealed extraordinary detail about the lives of ordinary Herculaneans. Their histories. The evidence of hard physical labor in the bones of the men and women who worked the docks and the fields. The presence of dental disease from the high sugar Roman diet of refined grain and honey. the healed fractures that record old injuries survived. Among the skeletal remains from Herculaneum's beachfront, one individual stands out in the archaeological record for what modern analysis has revealed about him. He was a young soldier in his late 20s or early 30s, found the fragments of his military equipment still around him. A sword, pieces of his belt fittings, the iron of his military boots. Isotopic analysis of his teeth, which corded the chemistry of the water a person drinks during childhood and early adolescence, showed he had not grown up near Herculaneum. He had come from somewhere else, possibly central or northern Italy, possibly further. He was so many Roman soldiers, a man far from home when the mountain ended his story. The bones of Rome itself tell a different kind of story. The story of the urban body, shaped by the specific demands and hazards of city life. Analysis of skeletal remains from Roman cemeteries in and around the city has documented the physical price of urban poverty in the ancient world. The spines of men who carried heavy loads show the characteristic compression fractures, and disc degeneration of decades of weight bearing. The leg bones of women who worked at grinding mills show and pushing. The teeth of the urban poor show the effects of poor nutrition in an early childhood. Enamel hypoplasia. Orthogonal lines in the tooth enamel, red periods of nutritional deprivation during the years when the teeth were forming. These lines are a kind of autobiography written in bone, a record of the specific months or seasons when a child did not get enough to eat. Perhaps the most disturbing skeletal discoveries in Rome's archaeological record are the mass graves and evidence of violence. The Lupercal Cave, identified by some archaeologists as the sacred cave where, according to Roman tradition, the she-wolf suckled Romulus and Remus, was discovered during consolidation work beneath the Palatine Hill in 2007. But the Palatine has also yielded evidence of a less legendary kind. The bones of infants deposited in the fills of wells and drainage channels. Evidence of the exposure and abandonment of unwanted children that Roman law permitted and that Roman moral philosophy debated without fully condemning. These small bones outstim as the same as any other archaeological deposit are a reminder that the brilliant civilization whose literary and art achievements continue to define the Western tradition rested on a set of social practices that modern values find deeply troubling. Ancient DNA analysis, which has advanced with extraordinary speed in the past decade, has begun to reveal the genetic history of the Roman population in ways that no previous technique could approach. Studies published between 2019 and 2024 used Indeed and TNP extracted from skeletal remains in Rome across the empire to track the movement of populations through Roman history. The results are striking. The genetic composition of the population of Rome itself shifted dramatically over the course of the imperial period. With increasing genetic input from the Eastern Mediterranean, from Greece, Anatolia, the Levant and Egypt, reflecting the massive population movements that the empire's economic and military integration possible. The Romans of the 1st and 2nd century CE, it quite different from the Romans of the Republican era, and quite different and again from it Bememans who came after them. The city was always, in the most biological sense, Chapter 3rd, reading. On the walls, voice of the ordinary Roman and fairly liberal of a modern the most distortion things about Ru's civilization from the perspective of a modern historian is how much of it ordinary people wrote down, not in books. The books that survive from antiquity are overwhelmingly, though, the products of the educated elite. The works of senators and philosophers and rhetoricians who had the leisure, the resources, and the cultural ambition to produce this praise and preservation. But on the walls of houses, of taverns, of baths, of temples, of public buildings, of streets, of the facades of shops, on every available vertical surface, Romans wrote. They scratched thoughts into the plaster with a nail or a stylus. They painted them in red or black with brushes. They pressed them into wet mortar before it hardened, and in one extraordinary city, the volcanic ash Vesuvius preserved these inscriptions, since completely they conceal them today, 1,000 years after the hands that made them were buried in the debris of the eruption. The graffiti of Pompeii, approximately 11,000 inscriptions recovered from the city's walls, constitute one of the most extraordinary archives in human history. They are extraordinary not because they record great events or profound thoughts, but precisely because they do not. They record the texture of ordinary life with a directness and specificity no literary source can match. They are the unedited voice of a Roman city, speaking across 2 millennia in the idioms of daily experience. Some of the Pompeians' inscriptions are commercial advertisements of upcoming events, gladiator games, notices of property for rent, announcements of the services available in particular establishments. These are informative, but relatively formal, more interesting, and far more revealing of the actual emotional, and social texture of urban Roman on life are the personal inscriptions, the declarations of love and contempt, the sports commentary, the boasts and insults and crude humor that the Romans scratched onto the walls of their neighborhood with. The same casual energy that people today might textmas in a assercilment oj. Successes, the weaver loves Iris, the innkeeper's slave girl. She doesn't care about him at all. He begs her to have pity on him, written by his rival. This inscription, found on a wall in Pompeii, was apparently a dialogue between two people, the lovelorn successes, his declaration, and an unnamed rival who added his own commentary below. Someone else then added a response in Success's defense. It is a quarrel conducted in writing on a public wall in a city that has been dead for nearly 2,000 years, and it reads with startling immediacy. The emotions are completely familiar. The situation is completely recognizable. The distance of 2 millennia collapses for a moment into nothing. The sports commentary amplified on Pompeian walls is equally vivid. The chariot racing factions, blues, greens, reds, and whites, generated passionate partisanship that's Brunt expressed with a directness that modern sports fans would recognize immediately. Greens appears on multiple walls. More elaborate inscriptions record the careers of specific charioteers, their victories and defeats, their nationalities, and their physical descriptions. One charioteer named Chrysens, who was of Moorish origin, had his career statistics, number of races, number of victories, total prize money, recorded it in an inscription of a length and detail that suggests a genuine celebrity culture around successful drivers. The gladiatorial graffiti of Pompeii are particularly revealing because they complicate the standard modern image of gladiatorial choreal combat as pure spectacle of. The inscriptions suggest a more picture. Individual gladiators are described with adjectives that belong to the vocabulary of romantic attraction of them. Ars suspirium puerum, a heartthrob of the girls, or glorios, gloriosus, glorious or invictus, undefeated. One gladiator named Celidus appears to have inspired multiple inscriptions of and commentary. These inscriptions suggest that the gladiatorial arena produced something more complex than simple death watching. It produced celebrities, objects of desire, figures around whom communities of fans organized their emotional lives. The gladiator as romantic ideal is a concept that does not fit neatly into the standard moral categories through which modern culture usually approaches Roman spectacle. Beyond Pompeii, the graffiti tradition of the Roman world is vast and still only partially catalogued. The epigraphic Datenbank Claude Slaby, the largest digital database of Latin inscriptions, contains more than 500,000 entries, and it is not complete. Inscriptions come every province of the empire, from the stone faces of quarries of Quarryton to the walls of bulbvilles in North Africa. From the rock surfaces of Alpine passes to the painted walls of houses in Ephesus and Alexandria, they record names and prayers and declarations of faith and profession of love and simple acts of presence. I was here, I passed through, I made this mark. Together they constitute an archive of human experience zones so large and so varied that scholars have barely begun to work through it systematically. Among the most unexpected categories of Roman inscription are the curse tablets, fictions, thin sheets of lead on which individuals inscribed their grievances and appeals for supernatural revenge, then rolled or folded them, and deposited them in sacred springs, wells, or tombs. Thousands of these tablets have been recovered from sites across the Roman world. With extraordinary candor about the darker dimensions of Roman social life. The lead tablets from the sacred spring at Bath in Britain are among the most famous. They record disputes about stolen property, requests for divine punishment of thieves and cheats, appeals for justice in legal disputes that the petitioner evidently did not trust the human courts to resolve. I have been robbed of my bronze vessel, writes one petitioner in a scratched latched that betrays his limited formal education. The goddess should not allow the person responsible to have health or sleep. Of the appeal, the confident expectation that a goddess would take a personal incidental interest in the recovery of a bronze bowl is entirely characteristic of the Roman religious sensibility at the level of daily life. Chapter Ver Engineering. The impossible Roman technology that should not have existed. The Romans were not in the visa. The Romans were not, in the modern sense, scientists. They did not pursue knowledge for its own sake with the systematic rigor that defines the modern scientific tradition. They did not have the theory of gravity or the periodic table or the germ theory of disease. What they had, instead, was something perhaps more impressive in some respects. Extraordinary practical intelligence applied to engineering problems. A willingness to experiment with materials and technique on a scale that was, for its time, almost incomprehensible, and results that in some cases have not been surpassed for 2,000 years. The most famous example is Roman concrete, opus caementicium, a material whose properties have fascinated modern materials scientists for decades. The Romans developed a hydraulic concrete volcanic called pozzolana that could set and harden underwater, and that has in many of its surviving structures grown stronger over time rather than weaker. This is not what modern concrete does. Modern concrete, which is based on cement developed in the 19th century, begins to grade from the moment it is poured. The Roman Pantheon, completed under Hadrian around 125 CE, has a concrete dome with a span of 43 meters. 43 meters. The largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world for nearly 19 centuries, until the construction of reinforced concrete structures in the 20th century. This dome has stood for nearly 2,000 years and shows sign of structural failure. The secret of Roman marine concrete. The concrete used to build harbor structures throughout the Mediterranean was definitively culled, only a tomb of only in 4217. When a team of researchers from the University of California, Berkeley analyzed samples from of harbor of Madishrima in Israel and from the port of Baiae Nivnipolis, they found something extraordinary. The concrete had not simply hardened and remained static over centuries. Seawater seeped through the structure had caused a chemical reaction. The volcanic ash, producing interlocking crystals of a rare mineral called aluminous taubermite within the concrete matrix. These crystals had grown into the cracks and voids in the material, actively healing from the inside. The Roman concrete had been, in a sense, alive, a self-reinforcing structure that grew stronger as the sea tried to destroy it. No modern building material does this. The implications for contemporary, sustainable construction in a world where Portland cement production is responsible approximately 8% of global carbon dioxide emissions are considerable. The Roman road system, approximately 80,000 kilometers of paved road at its greatest extent, connecting every corner of the empire from Scotland to Mesopotamia, is another engineering achievement that remarkable by any standard. But what the archaeology of Roman roads has revealed is not simply their extent, which was known from ancient sources. It is their construction technology. A popular Roman road was not a single layer of paving stones laid on the ground. It was a carefully engineered multi-layer structure built from the ground up with drainage in mind every stage. The road was excavated to a consistent depth. A layer of large flat stones was laid first, creating a stable foundation. Above this came alternating layers of smaller stones and compact rubble, each layer contributing to drainage and structural integrity. The surface, the famous smooth paving stones visible in surviving sections, was the final layer of a structure that could be 2 meters deep in waterlogged ground. One of the wildest discoveries related to Roman and engineering came not from a construction site, but from a museum storeroom. In 1900, Greek sponge divers recovered a mass of corroded bronze and wooden fronds and wooden fragments from a Roman-era shipwreck near the island of Antikythera, off the southern coast of Greece. The ship had sunk around 70 to 60 BCE. Among the cargo was an object that no one initially understood. It was a mass of corroded bronze gears, approximately 30 in total, housed in a wooden case roughly the size of a large shoebox. For decades after its recovery, it lay in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, partially examined and largely misunderstood. It was not until the work of the historian Derek Shea du Sola Price in the 1970s, forebode by increasingly sophisticated X-ray and Hafnia imaging in the early 21st century, the full complexity of the Antikythera mechanism became clearer. The device is a hand-powered mechanical computer, an analog calculating machine of extraordinary sophistication designed to predict astronomical events, the positions of the sun and moon, the timing of solar and lunar eclipses, the movements of the 5 planets known to the ancient world, the dates of the Olympic and other Panhellenic games. Its gear trains embody a mathematical understanding of astronomical cycles, including the Metonic sonic cycle of 19 years that reconciles the solar and lunar calendars. That represents the apex of ancient Greek astronomical knowledge, applied through mechanical engineering of a precision that was not equaled again in Europe until the clock-making tradition of the medieval period, more than 1,000 years later. The Antikythera mechanism is not merely an interesting artifact. It is a demonstration that the ancient world was capable of technological achievements that we had not, until its discovery, suspected were possible. The implications are troubling in the most productive sense. If this device was built, and it clearly was built, it exists. It has been physically analyzed in extraordinary detail. Then what else was the ancient world capable of that has not survived? The Antikythera mechanism survived because it sank into shipwreck and was buried under sediment at the bottom of the sea, protected from the recyclings and reused. Almost all ancient metalwork, how many similar devices made of the same expensive, reclaimable bronze were melted down in later centuries, their knowledge lost with them. The mechanism forces a fundamental mental reconsideration of the standard narrative of technological history, which sophisticated mechanical engineering is a phenomenon of the late medieval and early modern periods. The Romans and their Greek predecessors had capabilities in this area that the textbooks have consistently underestimated. The Roman aqueducts system deserves particular attention among engineering achievements. Not only for its scale. The 11 major aqueducts supplying the city of Rome, at the height of the empire, delivered approximately 1 million cubic meters of water per day to a population of perhaps 1 million people. Per capita daily water supply comparable to that of a modern European city. But for the precision of its surveying and hydraulic engineering, the Pont du Gard in southern France, the most complete surviving Roman aqueduct in the world, carries the channel of the Nime Sadak across the Agurden River on 3 tiers of arches, rising to a height of 49 meters. The aqueduct itself runs for approximately 50 kilometers from its source to the city. Over this entire distance, the channel maintains a nearly constant gradient, dropping only 17 meters in total. A fall of approximately 34 centimeters per kilometer. This precision, achieved without modern surveying equipment, using water levels and sighting instruments of their own construction, represents a mastery of practical hydraulics that was not surpassed until the development of modern precision leveling instruments, 18th and 19th centuries. Chapter VV Gods, Josts, and Geograph. On the Siam, the spirit, the spurled beneath it the surface, the world, with touch of the world, the Romans believed in a world that was saturated with divine presence, not divine presence of monotheistic kind, a single, all-powerful deity presiding over the universe from a position of supreme authority. Something far more complex, more intimate, and in some ways more demanding. The Roman world was full of gods, not merely the great Olympians of the official theologian, Jupiter and Juno, Mars and Venus, Minerva and Mercury, but a vast, shifting population of divine powers of every scale and function, from the cosmic to the local, from the universal to the intensely personal. Every spring had its Smith. Every doorway had its Janus. Every household had its Lares and Penates. Every crossroads had its presiding deity. Even the act of opening a door, the moment of threshold crossing, was attended by a divine presence. The archaeology of Roman religion has been, in many ways, the most surprising sector of the field. What excavation reveals about actual Roman religious practice, as opposed to the literary and Arian philosophical accounts of religion that make up most of what is known from ancient texts, often differs dramatically from what those texts suggest. The surviving religious objects recovered from Roman sites, the votive offerings left at shrines, the curse tablets deposited in sacred springs, the small terracotta figurines buried in household corners, the leaved amulets worn against evil, tell us stolismer of religious practice that was intensely practical, sometimes desperate, and governed by a transactional logic that scholars sometimes call do a divs. I give so that you will give. The Roman worshipper did not, in general, approach the divine with humble self-abasement. They approached with a proposition. Here is my offering. Here is my need. Honor the transaction. Among the wildest discoveries in Roman religious archaeology are deposits found at sacred springs and wells throughout the empire. At Coventina's well on Hadrian's Wall in Britain, excavated 1876, workers found a mass of approximately 14,000 coins spanning 3 centuries of Roman occupation, along with bronze figurines, incense burners, glass vessels, pottery, and human skulls. The coins ranged from tiny bronze issues, the silver denarii. Their presence generations of Ticiners who had come to the sacred spring to make offerings and requests. Covenantina herself, a woodish goddess whom the Romans and incorporated into their religious system with the characteristic thisness. A Roman religion, one of the most ecumenical in the ancient world, was represented in carved stone relief as a reclining figure pouring water, a vessel. The human skulls found in Coventina's well and in similar at other sites across Roman Britain represent one of the more disturbing puzzles Roman religious archaeology. Skull deposits, collections of human crania, often separated from the rest of the skeleton. In the fills, in rivers and different ozarks, and in sacred enclosures, appear at multiple sites in Roman Britain and Gaul. Their precise meaning remains debated. They may represent offerings to chthonic deities, gods of the underworld to whom the dead were assigned. They may be the remains of ritual killings, executions conducted in a sacred context. They may be the skulls of venerated ancestors, moved to places of particular sacred significance. They may be the debris of medical practice. There is evidence that the Romans used human skulls in certain pharmaceutical preparations. The probability is that different deposits have different explanations, and that the range of meanings attached to human skull deposits was itself wide and varied. The Mithric mysteries, one of the most intensely studied but still incompletely understood religious movements of the Roman imperial period, have left an extraordinary archaeological record. The worship of Mithras, deity of Iranian origin, whose cult was adopted by the Roman military and spread through the empire along the arteries of military service and trade. Trade was conducted in underground temples called Mithraea, designed evoke to the mythological cave in which Mithras killed the cosmic bull in an act of creation. These temples, cut into the earth or were constructed to appear cave-like, were small, intimate spaces capable of holding perhaps 30 to 40 worshippers at a time. They were not for general public worship. The Mithraic cult was an initiatory mystery religion, admitting only those had undergone a series of secret ritual ordeals. The discovery of intact Mithraea with ritual furnishings still in place has been a recurring feature of Roman archaeology. In London, excavation beneath a building site in 1954 revealed Abathrium. Its marble sculptures of Mithras slaying the bull, along with figures of other deities, carefully buried in the floor. The sculptures had been hidden, apparently deliberately, perhaps at the time of the Christianization of empire in the 4th century, when pagan temples were ordered. A similar cache was found beneath the streets of Rome itself. In 2016, restoration work on a building in the Circus Maximus district, Unquorum Ithrium, of extraordinary preservation, with painted walls still bearing traces of the ritual imagery that guided initiates through the mysteries. On the floor of the temple, someone had scattered a layer of fresh soil just before abandonment, a final ritual act, perhaps a burial of the sacred space itself. The Lupercal, the cave on the Palatine Hill associated with the foundation myth of Rome, the place where the she-wolf was said to have suckled Romulus and Remus, was discovered in 2007 during consolidation work on the Palatine. A probe camera sent into a cavity beneath the hillside revealed a domed chamber, approximately 8 meters deep and 9 meters in diameter. Its walls decorated with white pumice stone and colored mosaics, a large white eagle visible at the apex of the vault. Whether this is actually the cave that the Romans venerated as the Lupercal, the Sancta, the sacreds around which the festival of the Lupercalia was organized, the ritual whose celebrants ran through the streets of Rome in goat skins, striking path by striking pass, with leather straps ensure fertility, is disputed. But the chamber is clearly a sacred space of considerable antiquity and importance. And its discovery beneath the hill that was the heart of the Roman world carries a significance that transcends the Argi Grove.
Rome,
Once again, had something to say. Among the most unexpected discoveries in the spiritual geography of Rome is the evidence for the survival of pre-Roman religious synthesis and through the imperial period. The Romans were, by ancient standards, unusually tolerant of foreign religious practices, and the empire was genuinely polytheistic in a way that allowed remarkable religious diversity to flourish within it. But beneath the diversity of imported and artificial cults, the archaeology reveals persistent traces of practices that are far older. Iron Age votive deposits, pre-Roman sacred enclosures, ritual patterns that predate the founding of the city. Under the streets of Rome and in the soil of the Roman countryside, the older Italy is still present, still legible to those who know how to read it. The Romans built their world on top of a world that was already sacred, and that today practiced quietly beneath the marble and the concrete, into the age of Pyre Imyon. Chapter Feast Cram. Punishment. and the law, the dark side of the world's first legal system, Roman law, law, Oben. Law is one of the great intellectual achievements of the ancient world, and its influence on the legal systems of Europe and the Americas is both and profound. The Justinianic Code, compiled in the 6th century CE, based on centuries of Roman jurisprudence, shaped the civil law tradition that governs the legal systems of France, Germany, Italy, Spain, and most of Latin America. Concepts that are fundamental to modern Western law. The presumption of innocence, the distinction between civil and criminal liability, the principle that laws should be publicly known and consistent, applied, have their roots in the Roman legal tradition. This is the Rome that law schools invoke, the Rome of Cicero's forensics or legalisms, the Rome of the 12 Tables and the Corpus Juris Civilis. But Roman law also had a wildly darker side, and the archaeology of Roman crime and punishment has been resplendent detail. The gap between the ideals of the juristic tradition and the actual practices of Roman criminal justice was times an enormous one, shaped by the profound inequality of Roman society, by the legal detail distinction between those who had the protection of the law and those who did not, and by a punitive tradition that applied violence with a directness and variety that the sanitized phrase but does not adequately convey. The Roman practice of crucifixion, the execution method familiar from the Christian tradition, but whose historical reality is documented far more widely than that tradition alone, has left extraordinarily rare direct archaeological evidence. For decades, scholars knew crucifixion from literary and artistic sources, but had no physical evidence of a crucified individual. In 1968, excavation of first-century Jewish ossuary at Giva at Hamiftar in Jerusalem produced heel bone of a man named Yehohanan with an iron nail still driven through it at an angle that indicated the position of the feet during crucifixion. This was the first, and for decades the only, direct skeletal evidence crucifixion anywhere in the ancient world. In 2017, excavation at Fenstanton in Cambridgeshire, England, Romera burial, whose occupant had a nail driven through his heel bone in a manner consistent with crucifixion. The rarity of such finds reflects the fact that crucifixion victims were tip-buried. Their bare bodies were left on the cross to decompose, or thrown into mass graves. The fact that these individuals received burial at all, whether out of compassion or for reasons unknown, is what preserved the evidence. The Roman arena has left archaeological evidence that extends far beyond the gladiatorial iconography that fills Zeus Museum collections and popular culture. Excavation of the arena floor at the Colosseum and at other amphitheaters across the empire has revealed the complex substructure that made the spectacles possible. The underground corridors and lifts through which animals and fighters were raised to arena level. The drainage systems designed to carry away blood and waste after the events. The evidence of the various surfaces, sand, sawdust, different materials for different kinds of display that were laid over the travertine floor for different occasions. Analysis of the sand and soil recovered from arena contexts has revealed, in some cases, traces of blood, mud, and biological material that constitute the most physical evidence what actually happened in those spaces. More revealing, perhaps, than the arena itself are the burial sites of gladiators. The discovery of a gladiatorial cemetery at Abayasis in Turkey, excavated between REN 993 and 995, was a milestone in the understanding of who gladiators were and what their lives and deaths were actually like. The cemetery contained the skeletal remains of 68 individuals, predominantly young men in their late teens and 20s, showing the characteristic patterns of gladiatorial combat. Healed wounds consistent, the specific weapons used in different gladiatorial styles, evidence of careful medical treatment of injuries that would have been fatal without skilled intervention. An incisive evidence of the final fatal blow, a precise, deliberate strike to the skull or throat, delivered at close range, consist with the literary descriptions of the coup de grace administered to a defeated gladiator. The Ephesus gladiatorial cemetery also yield evidence for something the literary sources mention, but that modern popular culture tends to overlook: the systematic medical care given to gladiators, the healed injuries visible in the skeletal remains, fractures set and healed correctly, wounds that had clearly been cleaned and sutured, indicate a standard of medical treatment far above what most Romans of the laboring class could expect. Gladiators were expensive investments. A healthy, trained gladiator represented a significant sum of money. Schools that owned them employed physicians, specifically to maintain their value. The gladiatorial physician Galen, yes, the same Galen who became the most influential medical writer of antiquity, began his career attending to gladiators at the games in Pergamon, before Mumu, Rome, and eventually treating the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The connection between gladiatorial medicine and the development of medical practice was not incidental. The bodies of gladiators provided physicians with clinical caseload of traumatic injuries, that drove the development of surgical technique. The evidence for Roman torture and judicial violence is extensive and comes from multiple sources: literary, archaeological, and skeletal. The Romans made no pretense about the fact that torture was an accepted part of their judicial system. Slaves could not legally give testimony in court except under torture, a practice that the Roman juristic tradition debated and rationalized but never abolished. Free citizens of lower status could be tortured in cases involving certain serious crimes. The instruments of torture: the rack, the iron claws used to tear flesh, the heated metal implements described in accounts of Christian martyrdom and in the drier language of legal texts, is in the skeletal record that biological archaeologists are only beginning to learn to identify. The challenge is that bones heal, and healed injuries from torture are to distinguish from sentence or warfare. But in some cases, in the remains of executed individuals, in the skeletal deposits associated with prisons and place of punishment, the evidence is unambiguous. One of the most striking archaeological discoveries related to Roman crime and punishment came from excavation near the Roman Forum of Interamna Lianas in central Italy, where a deposit of skeletal material revealed individuals who had been executed and then apparently subject to posthumous mutilation, a practice from literary sources as damnatio memoriae applied to bodies, an attempt to deny the dead even the coherence of their physical remains. The bodies had been treated with deliberate violence that extended beyond killing, of violence directed the corpse itself as an object of punishment. This is the darkest end of the Roman legal tradition. None the elegant reasoning of the jurists, but the physical reality of a state was willing that in certain smut penitences, not beyond the boundary of EE. Chapter Fruit, Trade, Money, and the Global, how we connected the ancient world, El Hublabil Ubrol El in 2000 year. In the year 2010, a team of geologists drilling ice cores from the Greenland ice sheet found something that had nothing to do with their primary research. A record preserved in atmospheric lead deposited in the ice of the rise and fall of ancient economies. The lead in the ice came from smelting operations, the refining of silver from lead ore, a process that produces lead fumes that disperses into the atmosphere and eventually settle as dust on the surface of polar ice. The Greenland cores showed a dramatic increase in atmospheric lead beginning around 800 BCE. Coincident the expansion of Greek mining operations in Spain and Sardinia. This lead level further during the Roman Republican period and reached its pre-industrial maximum during the height of the Roman Empire. CE. It then declined sharply during the crisis of 3rd century, recovered partially during the 4th century, and did not return to Roman imperial levels until the Industrial Revolution of the 18th century. The ice core data is one of the most compelling pieces for the extraordinary scale and adore of the Roman economy. The Roman Empire was not merely political and military entity. It was economic system of enormous complexity, connecting producers and consumers across a geographic range that from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the borders of India and beyond. Goods moved through this system quantities that modern scholars have struggled to adequately quantify, but whose scale is visible in the archaeological record at every turn. The amphora, the standard Roman transport container for liquids and certain dry goods, is the single most numerous artifact type in Roman archaeology. Millions of amphora fragments have been recovered across the empire and beyond, and their distribution patterns are a map of the Roman economy. Different amphora types produced in different regions and carried the characteristic goods of those regions. The Drusu amphora produced in the Guadalquivir Valley of southern Spain, carried olive oil. The Dressel 2-4 type from Italy and Gaul carried wine. The 1770 from Spain carried defrutum, a concentrated grape syrup used as a sweetener. The North African amphora typed fish sauce and oil. By tracking the distribution of amphora types in the archaeological record, scholars can reconstruct the trade routes of the Roman world with remarkable precision. Monte Testaccio in Rome, approximately 35 meters high and 1 kilometer in circumference, rising near the Tiber riverbank in the city's Trastevere district, is not a natural feature. It is made entirely of broken amphora sherds. The discarded fragments of perhaps 25 million amphora, most of them Dressel, the olive oil containers from Badetica in Spain, deposited but over the course of approximately 2 centuries of intensive trade, roughly from the late 1st century BCE to the late 3rd CE. This hill of broken pottery is one of the most remarkable monuments to economic action. A physical record of the volume of a single commodity flowing into a Stangle city. Over 2 centuries, the Dressel 20 amphora were not recycled after use because the olive oil they carried left a rancid residue in the clay that contaminated subsequent contents. They therefore deliberately broken and deposited in this organized dump near the warehouses where the oil had been unloaded. Monte Testaccio is a monument to consumption on an imperial scale. The Roman economies reached beyond the boundaries of the empire, has been documented by a series extraordinary archaeological discoveries in unexpected locations. In 2010, excavations at the site of Berenike on the Red Sea coast host of Egypt, Roman port city, that served as the eastern terminus of the trade routes connecting the Empire and India and beyond, revealed deposits of black pepper, teak wood, and cotton cloth of Indian origin, along with fragments of Tamil Brahmi inscriptions that constitute earliest evidence of Druidism. Vitinganguindi and the Tamil-speaking south of India, the quantities of pepper covered from the Berenike deposits were striking. A storage jar containing several kilograms of black peppercorns had been as a religious offering, suggesting that pepper, which in Rome commanded prices that made it weight for weight among the most expensive commodities in the empire, was available at the port of origin in quantities large enough to be offered to the gods. The connection between Rome and India, merely commercial. It was cultural and intellectual as well, mediated through the intermediary worlds of the Arabian Peninsula and the Persian Gulf. Roman coins, gold ore and silvers, dinardi, have been found in archaeological sites across southern India, concentrated in the regions that were the sources of the spices, cotton, and gemstones that Roman merchants sought. Indian artifacts, ivories, textiles, spices appear in Roman contexts across the empire, and the literary sources on both sides record the relationship. Roman authors describe the drain of gold to India with an anxiety that sounds remarkably modern. An early version of the Dedesa worry. While Tamil poetry from the Sangam period, Brahmiskalgam the Skrilid, the large-bellied ships of the Yavanas, the foreigners from the bringing wine and taking pepper in exchange, the financial infrastructure that supported this trade was itself a remarkable achievement. Roman banking, the network of argentari and mensari who provided money-changing deposits and lending services throughout the empire, was sufficiently sophisticated to allow letters of credit to function across the empire's breadth, enabling merchants conduct transactions in Rome that were settled in Alexandria or Antioch without the physical transfer of coin. The legal mechanisms that supported this financial system, the contractual forms, the liability rules, the partnership arrangements, were developed with a technical precision. It has influenced commercial law traditions to the present day. The discovery that has perhaps most dramatically illustrated the Roman commercial, came not from excavation, but from the analysis of a single papyrus document found in Egypt. The Muziris papyrus, dating to Biaxmit 150 to 1 Anna Sebrani CE, am now in the Austrian National Library in Vienna, is a partially preserved contract for a commercial loan financing a shipment of goods from the Indian port of Muziris on the Malabar coast to Egypt. The document records the cargo, which included ivory, fabric, and the product described as nard, likely spikenard, a fragrant oil of great commercial value, and the financial arrangements surrounding the loan, with sufficient detail to allow scholars to estimate the value of the cargo at approximately 7 million. This is a single shipment, documented in a single contract that survived only by accident. It represents a transaction, enormous scale, conducted ordinary merchants using financial instruments of considerable sophistication, linked two worlds separated by thousands of kilometers of sea. The Roman economy at its height was genuinely global. Chapter of Tertiary, the end and the after, what Rome left behind. What it became a yo wolil to the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The conventional endpoint of which historians have traditionally placed at 476 CE, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, the boy Romulus Augustulus, is one of the most discussed events in all of historical writing. Gibbon devoted 6 volumes to it. Scholars have proposed, by one recent count, over 200 explanations for why it happened, ranging from climate change to lead poisoning to the destabilizing effects of Christoculture. One civic culture. What the archaeology of Rome's late antique transition has revealed, however, is something more complex and in many ways more interesting than dramatic collapse narrative suggests. Rome did not simply fall. It transformed. The transformation was real, and it involved genuine losses of population, economic complexity, of the specific forms of literary and technical culture the imperial system had sustained, but it had also involved continuities that are more extensive than the standard narrative acknowledges. And it involved the creation of something new that was not simply a degraded version of what had come before. The archaeological record of the 5th and 6th CE in the Western Empire is a record of change, and change is not the same as ending. The evidence for population decline in the late antique Western Empire is real and sobering. Surveys of Roman-era settlement patterns in Britain, Gaul, Spain, and Italy show a significant reduction in the number of occupied sites from the late 3rd century onward, with particularly dramatic evidence of abandonment in the 4th and 5th centuries. The towns of Roman Britain, Roxanen, Roxter, Cirencesterns, Albans, show evidence of reduced activity and, in some cases, the conversion of urban stone buildings into timber structures, into timbers of kind associated with post-Roman vernacular architecture. This is not destruction. It is adaptation. But it is adaptation under conditions of reduced resources and reduced population. And what it produced physically and culturally different from what preceded it. Itself, the population decline was catastrophic by any measure. A city that had housed perhaps 1 million people at the height of the imperial period was, by the 7th century CE, a settlement perhaps a 20 to 30,000 clustered in the river bend of the end of the Tiber, surrounded by the vast ruins of a world their grandparents could not have built. The great public monuments, the forums, the baths, the taths, stood or were converted to new uses. The Colosseum became a fortress, and then quarry its marble and bronze stripped away for reuse in new construction. The Pantheon, consecrated as a Christian church in 6 non Ciliae, Thixtus Prespistis, it was put to new use. Hundreds of other monuments did not. The conversion of Roman temples to Christian churches is one of the most extensively documented processes in the archaeology of the late antique West. In Rome and across the empire, the architectural shells of pagan sacred buildings were adapted, with varying degrees of modification, for Christian worship. The Pantheon is the most famous example, by no means the only one. In Sicily, the Temple of Athena at Therasarchia, a magnificent structure dating to the 5th century BCE, was converted to a cathedral whose walls still contain the original temple columns, visible in the nave arcade. In France, the Temple of Augustus and Livia at Vienne, one of the best preserved Roman temples outside Italy, was converted to a church and later to a museum, preserving it intact through the centuries. In Turkey, the vast temple at Aphrodite at Aphrodisias was reoriented and converted to a church. The apse of the Christian building replacing the cult statue of the goddess at the eastern end. The wildest discoveries associated with Rome's ending and transformation have come from the examination of what was buried or abandoned. In the final years of the Western Empire, the Hoxne hoard, discovered in a field in Suffolk, England, in 1992 by a farmer searching for a lost hammer with a metal detector, the largest of late Roman gold and silver ever found in Britain. It contained 14,860 coins of gold silver and silver solidi of the late 4th and early 5th centuries, along with 200 pieces of gold and silver jewelry, silver spoons, and personal objects of remarkable quality. The hoard had been packed into a wooden chest and buried around 407 to 4488 CE, the moment of Memnon crisis in Roman Britain. When Constantine III headed to the island at Struts garrus troops for his bid for the Western imperial throne, and the first barbarian raids were beginning to destabilize the Welthans. someone buried their wealth a moment of danger and never came back for it. Their loss is our extraordinary gain. The Staffordshire Moorlands pen, discovered in 2003, is a different kind of discovery. A small enamel vessel, dating to the 2nd century CCE, whose inscription names 4 forts on Hadrian's Wall. It is a souvenir, the Roman equivalent of a tourist memento, purchased by someone who had served on the wall or visited it and wanted a keepsake of the experience. That this object exists, that it was made and sold and bought, tells us something important about the cultural experience of the Roman frontier. That it was, for the people who lived and served there, a place with a particular identity, one worth commemorating, one that generated the kind of attachment that people express. Home souvenirs. The most profound discovery that Roman archaeology has made is made, perhaps not any single object or site, but cumulative understanding. Building over decades of excavation and analysis of the scale of the human investment represented by the Roman world, the roads, aqueducts, the buildings, the harbors, the mines, the agricultural systems, the urban infrastructure. All of it was built and maintained by human labor, most of it by people who left no individual record. The monuments of Rome are not the achievements of emperors. They are the achievements of millions of workers, soldiers, administrators, craftsmen, farmers, traders, and slaves, whose collective effort created something that has not been equaled in scale or duration by any civilization before the modern period. When we stand in the Pantheon and look up at that dome, or walk along a surviving stretch of Roman road in the Italian countryside, or read the graffiti of Pompeii with its startling directness, we are not encountering the past as a finished thing, sealed off from the present by the barrier of time. We are encountering the residue of lives that were as complex, as fully experienced as of our own, lives that built something so large and so durable that 2,000 years of weather and war and recycling and development have not been able to erase it, really. The discoveries continue. The ground is still speaking. And what it says in its slow, material, irreversible language is that the Romans were here, and that being here, they made a world, and that the world is still, in more ways than we usually acknowledge the world we inhabit. End of scripty. End of scripty. This narration script is grounded in peer-reviewed archaeological scholarship and primary historical sources, including evidence from the Antikythera Mechanides Research Project, the Grilling and Ice Core Atmospheric Lead Studies, the Berkelium Conservation Project, the Epigraphic Dagenbake Cloth Slaby, the Missouri Papyrus Studies, and excavation reports from sites including Pompeii Ephesus, Berenike, Hadrian's Wall, and the city of Rome itself.